This ring means nothing. You don't deserve love." Kimberly's words echoed in my ears as she laughed and tossed my wedding ring into the trash. My heart stopped for a moment. That ring represented 53 years of marriage to the love of my life, Richard, who had passed away just 8 months earlier. My hands were shaking and my heart was breaking, but she didn't know. I was keeping a secret that would shatter her perfect world. A secret I was reluctant to reveal, not out of fear of her, but out of love for my son Matthew. In that moment, looking at my daughter-in-law's face contorted into an expression of contempt, I knew I had reached my limit. For the past 3 years since moving into their home after Richard's death, I had tolerated her daily insults, her constant put-downs, and the way she isolated me from my own son and grandchildren. I had become a shadow in a house I had helped buy with my life savings. $180,000 of our retirement savings were given to Matthew and Kimberly to buy their dream home in Boston. I thought I was helping my family, building a legacy, a place where we could all be happy. I never imagined this home would become my prison. As I watched Kimberly walk away with a victorious smile on her face, I slowly knelt to retrieve the ring from the trash. I wouldn't allow 53 years of love to be discarded as if they meant nothing. In that moment, something shifted inside me. Grief turned to determination. I wasn't just Elizabeth Parker, the inconvenient mother-in-law who occupied the back bedroom. I was Elizabeth Parker, widow of Richard Parker, mother of Matthew, and grandmother of Sophie and Noah. And I had a secret that would change everything. It all began when Richard passed away after a 2-year battle with pancreatic cancer. We both knew his time was limited, so we planned everything meticulously. Richard had been an accountant for 40 years, and no one knew the value of planning better than he. We prepared our documents, organized our assets, and discussed how I should move forward. We were never wealthy, but we had saved enough to ensure I could live comfortably for the rest of my life. Our apartment in Chicago was paid off, and we had investments that would provide enough for my needs. I remember the last serious conversation we had about the matter 3 weeks before he passed away. Richard lay in our bed, weaker by the day, but his mind was still as sharp as ever. "Elizabeth," he said, holding my hand with the last of his strength, "promise me you will take care of yourself before taking care of others. I've seen so many widows sacrifice everything for their children and end up destitute. I don't want that for you. Promise me." I promised, of course, holding her slender hands in mine, seeing the golden ring I had placed on her finger more than 5 decades earlier. How could I have imagined that promise would be tested so severely so soon when Richard passed away on a cold January morning? The world seemed to have lost its color. We had met when we were both in our 20s, at a time when the world was full of possibilities. A chance encounter in a college library had turned into 53 years of companionship, shared challenges, joys, and eventually a family. Matthew was born after 5 years of trying our little miracle that brought a whole new dimension to our love. We endured financial hardships in the early years, career changes, the loss of my parents, and then Richard's parents, but always together, always partners. And now I was alone, trying to navigate a world that seemed too big and too cold without him by my side. The funeral was small but meaningful. Richard didn't like fanfare. Matthew came with Kimberly and the children, of course. It was the first time I'd seen my grandchildren in almost a year, as the distance between Chicago and Boston made visits less frequent than I'd liked. Sophie, with her intelligent eyes, seemed to understand the solemnity of the occasion, despite her 8 years. Noah, just 5, was confused, asking repeatedly when Grandpa would wake up. Each question was like a small dagger in my heart. But then came the phone call from Matthew 3 weeks after the funeral. He was in tears, explaining that the company where he worked as a marketing manager was struggling, and that while he hadn't lost his job, he had taken a major pay cut. At the same time, he and Kimberly had found the perfect house in Boston, but they needed a larger down payment than they had planned. Even with Kimberly's salary as a real estate agent, they wouldn't be able to raise the necessary amount in time. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I sold our apartment in Chicago, gave them $180,000 for the down payment, and used the rest to buy a small trust fund that would be my financial security. Matthew insisted that I move to Boston with them. The house had 5 bedrooms, more than enough space for everyone, and that way I could help with Sophie, who was 8 at the time, and Noah, who was only 5. I was reluctant to leave Chicago, where I had lived my entire life, but the prospect of being close to my grandchildren was too tempting to resist. The idea of becoming an integral part of their lives, watching them grow day by day, was a gift I couldn't refuse. Plus, Matthew seemed genuinely excited about the idea. I remember the day I left our Chicago apartment for the last time. 53 years of memories were contained within those walls. The corner of the living room where Richard always read his Sunday paper. The kitchen where we cooked dinner together, dancing to the radio. The small office where he worked on his projects after retirement. I walked through each room, absorbing the details, knowing I would never return. In each room, I whispered a goodbye to Richard, feeling his presence in every familiar corner. At the last moment, I paused at the door and looked back one last time. "Am I doing the right thing, Richard?" I asked the silence. "I am being practical and sensible, as you always have been." But the apartment remained silent, offering neither confirmation nor warning. The move to Boston was exhausting physically and emotionally. At 75, I no longer had the energy I used to, and the idea of starting a new life in a new city was daunting. But for Matthew, for Sophie, and for Noah, I would do anything. When I arrived at the new house, I was genuinely impressed. It was spacious and bright, with a large backyard where the children could play. Matthew showed me the room that would be mine, an airy second-floor room with a garden view. "Kimberly chose it," he said proudly. "She wanted you to have the best guest room." I was touched by the gesture, not realizing the meaning of the word. Guess. It wasn't my home, even though I had contributed significantly to its purchase. I was a guest, a long-term visitor, not a permanent resident. But at that moment, distracted by the excitement of my arrival, by the enthusiastic hugs of my grandchildren, I didn't notice this subtle and crucial distinction. At first, everything seemed perfect. The house was spacious and beautiful in a leafy Boston neighborhood with large windows that let in sunlight and a backyard where the children could play. Kimberly seemed grateful for my financial help and my willingness to care for the children while she and Matthew worked. I cooked dinner most nights, helped Sophie with her homework, took Noah to the park, and kept the house tidy. It was 3 months of relative harmony during which I truly believed I had found a new purpose, a new family. I loved mornings with Noah, his childlike enthusiasm for everything from the ants in the garden to the stories I read to him. He would curl up in my lap, smelling of baby shampoo and cookies, and I would feel useful, loved, needed. Sophie was more reserved by nature, but even she began to open up to me. She showed me her favorite books, let me braid her hair in the morning, and occasionally shared whispered secrets about her school friends. I savored these moments, these connections that were being built day by day, moment by moment. When I tucked the children into bed at night after stories and lullabies, I thought of Richard, wishing he could see our grandchildren growing up, wishing he could be by my side in this new phase of life. But at least I had a part of him in Matthew, in the familiar features I sometimes glimpsed in my son's face, in his laugh that was so much like his father's. But then I started noticing small changes in Kimberly's behavior. Subtle comments about how I folded the laundry, complaints about the meals I prepared, remarks about how I was spoiling the kids. At first, I tried to adapt my behavior. After all, I was in her house, and I wanted to be helpful, not a burden. But as the weeks passed, the comments became more frequent and more direct. The first time I realized something was fundamentally wrong was when I overheard Kimberly talking on the phone to a friend on the back porch, unaware that I was watering the plants near the open window. "Yes, she's living with us now," Kimberly said with an audible sigh. "It's a nightmare, to be honest. She's always around, always wanting to help, always offering opinions on how we should raise the kids. But what can I do? She put the down payment on the house, so we're kind of stuck with her now." I stood still, the water from the watering can overflowing onto the floor as I absorbed her words. Was this how she saw me, like an unwanted obligation, a burden to be borne? The pain of that revelation was sharp and immediate. That night, I couldn't sleep, replaying her words in my mind, questioning every interaction we'd had since my arrival. Was I truly being intrusive? Was I imposing my opinions? I tried to remember Richard's advice to take care of myself first, but it was difficult when my desire to be useful, to be part of the family, was so strong. I clearly remember the day I realized things had changed irreversibly. It was a Sunday, and I had prepared a roast. Richard's favorite recipe, something we used to eat on special occasions during our marriage. It was my small tribute to him, a way to keep him present in our lives. I had spent the whole morning in the kitchen, seasoning the meat with fresh herbs from the small garden I had started in the kitchen window, peeling and cutting potatoes, making homemade gravy, just as Richard loved. When Matthew walked into the kitchen and smelled the aroma, his face lit up with a mixture of surprise and nostalgia. "Daddy's roast," he said softly, and for a moment we connected in our shared memory, in our shared longing. It was a precious but brief moment. When I set the plate on the table, Kimberly looked at the food and said in a tone of voice that mixed disdain and false concern, "Elizabeth, do you really think you should be cooking? Such heavy dishes. Children need a balanced diet, not this kind of old-fashioned food you and Richard used to eat. We'll need to establish a healthier menu." I felt like I'd been slapped in the face. It wasn't just a criticism of my food, it was an attack on my life with Richard, on our traditions, on our memories. Matthew said nothing, just continued eating in silence, avoiding my gaze. That night, I cried alone in my room, feeling for the first time the weight of Richard's absence in a new and painful way. I no longer had my companion, my ally, the person who had always been by my side for over 5 decades. I hugged my pillow that night, remembering how Richard always found the right words to comfort me in difficult times. I remembered the time I lost my first job as a nurse due to budget cuts at the hospital, and how he held me as I cried, telling me I was valuable and talented, that I would find something better. And he was right, as always. I remembered when our first son James was stillborn, the devastation we felt, and how Richard never let me fall into the abyss of despair, how he cried with me, but also reminded me that we still had each other, that we could still try again when we were ready. And so we did, and Matthew came into the world 3 years later, healthy and perfect. Now in an unfamiliar room, in an unfamiliar city, I felt Richard's absence like a hole in my chest. What would he say now? How would he advise me to handle this situation? He was always so good at navigating family conflicts, at finding diplomatic solutions, too. Difficult problems. But then, as I burst into tears, a thought occurred to me. Richard was no longer here to defend me, to counsel me, to be my shield against the world. I needed to learn to be my own shield now. It was a frightening thought, but also somehow empowering. I eventually fell asleep, exhausted from crying, but with a small seed of resilience planted in my heart. From that day on, things only got worse. Kimberly began reorganizing the house, moving my belongings into a small back room, claiming she needed the larger bedroom I was occupying to create a home office. I didn't want to cause trouble, so I agreed, even though the new room barely had room for my bed and a small dresser. Many of my belongings ended up in boxes in the basement, temporarily stored. Kimberly assured me, but somehow there was never the time or space to bring them back. Gradually, my photographs with Richard disappeared from the living room walls, replaced by portraits of Kimberly with the children and Matthew. When I asked about this, she replied that the old photos made the house feel like a museum, and that they needed a more modern look. One photograph in particular, my favorite, of Richard and me on our 40th wedding anniversary, simply disappeared. When I asked Kimberly about it, she shrugged and said casually, "Oh, it must have broken during the cleaning. But don't worry, I'm sure you have many others." I searched everywhere, desperate to recover that precious image. Eventually, I found it in the basement, the glass shattered and the frame damaged, tossed in a box of discarded items. I wept as I carefully removed the photograph from the broken frame, smoothing its crumpled edges. It was just a piece of paper, I knew, but it represented a moment of pure happiness, a tangible fragment of a life that now existed only in my memories. I hid the photo in my diary, keeping it close to my heart. Then came the kitchen restrictions. Kimberly decided I was making too much of a mess and that it would be best if I limited use of the kitchen to specific times when she wasn't using it. First came the kitchen, then the living room, where I was apparently disarranging the cushions and leaving tea stains on the tables. The powder room on the first floor was declared off limits because it was for guests, and I was to use only the bathroom attached to my bedroom in the back. Slowly, I was confined to my room, leaving only for specific tasks or when requested. When Noah asked me one afternoon why I didn't watch TV with them any more in the evenings, Kimberly quickly replied that Grandma needs her rest, as if I were an invalid who couldn't handle a few hours of family activity. In fact, I had been informed that very morning that the living room sofa was too delicate for daily use and that I should limit my time on the living room. The physical isolation was painful, but the emotional isolation was devastating. The worst part, however, was the gradual isolation of my son and grandchildren. Matthew worked long hours, and when he was home, Kimberly made sure he was busy with household projects or family activities that mysteriously never included me. Family dinner, there wasn't enough room at the kitchen table, so I ate before or after, usually alone in my room. Sunday picnics in the park, someone had to stay behind and check the clothes in the dryer. Movies. The movie wasn't appropriate for older people. One by one, all the family moments I had so happily anticipated were taken away. As for the children, Sophie, now 9, began echoing her mother's comments, asking why Grandma was so old-fashioned and why I couldn't be more normal. One day, when I offered to help her with her homework like I used to, she rolled her eyes in a way that was eerily similar to her mother's and said, "Mommy says your way of teaching math is confusing and outdated. I'll wait for her to get home." Each small rejection felt like a wound, small but painful, and they accumulated day after day. Noah, still too young to fully understand what was happening, still ran into my arms when he saw me, but these occasions became increasingly rare as Kimberly insisted on keeping the children busy with extracurricular activities and playdates, strategically planned during the times I usually spent time with them. Sophie had been the hardest hit by Kimberly's manipulations, but even she occasionally showed flashes of her old affection. One morning, while Kimberly was in the shower and Matthew had already left for work, Sophie slipped quietly into my room, looking nervous and glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one saw her. "Grandma," she whispered, holding something hidden behind her back. "I made this for you." It was a drawing done with colored pencils and glitter, showing 2 figures holding hands, one small and one large. "Grandma and me," she explained, her eyes searching for my approval. "We did it at school for Mother's Day, but I wanted to make one for you too. But Mom said you already have enough drawings and don't need any more mess." My heart broke at the thought of my granddaughter hiding her affection for me, feeling she had to keep our relationship a secret. I hugged her tightly, thanking her for the drawing and assuring her it was the most beautiful I'd ever seen. I promised to keep it in a special place where no one would find it, our little secret. After she left, I hid the drawing in my journal along with the photograph of Richard and me, another treasure to protect, another connection to preserve against the constant erosion of my existence in that house. I felt as if I were slowly fading away, becoming invisible in my own family's life. And the most painful thing was seeing how Matthew allowed it to happen. My son, who had always been kind and considerate, seemed to have become a passive observer of my degradation. Or maybe it had always been this way and I had never noticed because Richard was there to protect me, to ensure I was never treated with less than the respect I deserved. I began to question my memories, wondering if I had idealized my son, if I had been blind to flaws in his character that were now becoming painfully evident. Or perhaps it was the pressures of being the breadwinner for a family in difficult times, the financial stress, the long work hours, and Kimberly's constant influence that had changed him. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. I was alone in this battle. This became irrefutably clear during a particularly difficult night in July, about 4 months after I moved. Noah had fallen on the school playground and cut his chin, requiring stitches. The school had called Kimberly, but she was in an important client meeting and couldn't leave. Matthew was at a conference out of town. So they called me, and of course I rushed to be with my grandson. I held his hand in the emergency room while the doctor stitched his chin, praising his bravery and promising ice cream afterward as a reward. When we returned home, Kimberly arrived about an hour later, visibly irritated. "Why didn't you call me right away?" she demanded, completely ignoring the fact that I had competently handled the situation. "And what's this about ice cream? He shouldn't be rewarded for getting hurt." It was an unfair scolding delivered in front of Noah, diminishing my authority and turning my act of caring into something to be criticized. Later, when I tried to talk to Matthew about the incident on the phone, he seemed distracted and rushed. "It's just her way, Mom," he said. "She gets anxious around the kids. Don't take it personally." But how could I not take it personally when every interaction seemed specifically designed to diminish me, to make me feel incompetent and unwanted in September? About 6 months after my move, I tried to talk to Matthew. I waited for a rare moment when we were alone when Kimberly had taken the kids to a birthday party. I told him how isolated I was feeling, how it felt like I was losing my place in the family. I tried to be careful with my words, not wanting to sound like I was criticizing his wife, but needing him to understand the gravity of the situation. "Matthew, I know we're all adjusting to new arrangements, and I understand that this is your home and that I need to respect that. But in the last few months, I've been feeling increasingly ... left out. It feels like I'm more of an unwelcome guest than part of the family." He listened silently, his face a mask of discomfort. When I finished, he sighed deeply and said, "Mom, I think you're overreacting. Kimberly is just trying to keep the house organized, and she has her own way of doing things. You need to understand that this is her home and we all need to adapt. Maybe if you tried to be a little more flexible, things would improve." His words hit me like a punch in the gut. It was as if he couldn't see what was happening right before his eyes, or worse, he could see it but had chosen to ignore it. I felt tears welling up, but I held them back. I didn't want him to see me cry, didn't want to seem like the hysterical, emotional mother-in-law Kimberly undoubtedly portrayed me as. "Maybe you're right," I said, forcing a smile. "I just miss spending time with you and the kids." He seemed relieved that I didn't press the issue, vaguely promising that we would try to do more things together as a family. But we both knew it was an empty promise, words spoken only to end an uncomfortable conversation. In that moment, I realized I was truly alone in this battle. The next day, Kimberly entered my room without knocking, something she'd begun doing with increasing frequency. A small demonstration of how my privacy meant nothing to her. She smiled, that fake smile I'd learned to dread, and said, "Elizabeth, I had a conversation with Matthew and we agreed it would be best if you contributed financially to the household expenses. After all, you use electricity, water, and food like the rest of us. I thought $1,500 a month would be a fair amount." I was shocked, not only by the amount, which represented almost the entire monthly income from my small investment fund, but by the audacity of the request. I'd given them $180,000, an amount that represented years of careful saving by Richard and I so they could buy this house. And now they were charging me rent when I mentioned it. Kimberly just shrugged and said, "That was a gift, Elizabeth. And gifts don't come with strings attached, do they? Besides, the cost of living in Boston is high, and we need to think about the children's future. I'm sure you understand." Her logic was so twisted, so obviously manipulative, that for a moment I was speechless. How could she recharacterize my enormous financial contribution as a gift without conditions, and then in the same breath impose conditions on my very existence in the house? It was blatant hypocrisy. But I was cornered with no immediate options, so I reluctantly agreed, feeling as if I were being robbed in broad daylight. That night, lying in my narrow bed in the small back room, I thought about all the choices that had led me to this point, all the ways I had tried to do the right thing, to be useful, not to be a burden, only to end up being treated as a source of income, not as a beloved member of the family. I wanted to scream, to throw in her face that without my gift, they wouldn't have this house, that I had sacrificed my independence and financial security for them. But instead, I swallowed my anger and agreed. What else could I do? I had nowhere else to go, not right away. My apartment in Chicago had been sold, and the remaining money wouldn't be enough to buy a new place or even rent anything decent for long. I was stuck. I started transferring $1,500 into Kimberly's account at the beginning of each month, leaving me with only $400 for all my other expenses. I began skimping on everything from toiletries to clothes. The small luxuries I once took for granted, a new book, a professional haircut, the occasional lunch out, became unaffordable. My already modest wardrobe began showing signs of wear and tear I could no longer ignore. When I needed to buy a new pair of shoes because my old ones were completely worn out, I felt guilty for wasting money. The mended socks, the carefully mended sweaters, the frayed pants all became silent symbols of my financial degradation. But the indignity went beyond financial hardship. It was the constant suggestion, never explicitly stated but ever present, that I should be grateful for having a roof over my head, as if it were a charity bestowed upon me, not something to which I had meaningfully contributed. And yet Kimberly found new ways to make me feel like a burden. She began commenting on how long I spent in the shower, suggesting I was wasting water. I began timing my showers, limiting them to 5 minutes no matter how cold it was or how sore my joints. She complained about how I used too many lights in my room, driving up the electricity bill. I began using only a small lamp even when trying to read, or so straining my age-awakened eyes. Even using the heater in the winter became a point of contention with her, insisting I should use more blankets. Instead of wasting money heating the whole house, many nights I shivered under layers of blankets. The Boston cold, much harsher than I was used to in Chicago, especially in the small back room that seemed to retain very little heat. Even food became a source of anxiety. Kimberly began labeling items in the refrigerator with the names of specific family members, ensuring I knew exactly what I could and couldn't eat. My share was noticeably smaller and less varied than everyone else's, despite my financial contribution. I began buying my own supplies on a limited budget, keeping them in a small box in my room, a move that made me feel more like a boarder in a rooming house than a grandmother in the family home. And then came Christmas the 1st without Richard. It was a particularly difficult time, full of memories and traditions that now seemed painfully absent. Richard loved Christmas, more excited than the children themselves, waking up early on Christmas morning to make everyone hot chocolate before opening presents. He wore the same red Christmas sweater every year, so worn in places that I secretly mended it each November. He always insisted on using the star ornament his parents had brought from Germany on top of the tree, a family heirloom passed down through generations. But in this new home, all those traditions had been replaced. Kimberly's tree was decorated with a carefully coordinated color scheme, with no handmade or sentimental ornaments allowed. The Christmas menu had been planned without my input, without any of the traditional dishes we had enjoyed for years. I was determined to make it special for the grandchildren, so I saved 4 months to buy meaningful gifts. For Sophie, I found a special edition of the book series she loved. For Noah, an elaborate construction set that I knew would spark his creativity. I wrapped everything carefully, anticipating the joy on his faces on Christmas morning. But when I came downstairs that morning, I discovered that the presents I'd placed under the tree the night before had been moved to a corner, almost hidden behind a pile of larger, more eye-catching gifts, all labeled Mommy and Daddy. When the children opened my presents, Kimberly was beside them, whispering something in their ears. Sophie glanced at the books and forced a smile politely, thanking them before half-heartedly putting them aside. Noah didn't even fully open his construction set before Kimberly distracted him, pointing to a much larger electronic toy. Later that day, while everyone was watching a Christmas movie in the living room, I retired to wash the dishes from Christmas dinner alone. Kimberly had insisted I do it since she'd cooked. That's when I saw through the kitchen window my presents abandoned in the trash can outside. The carefully chosen books for Sophie, the construction set for Noah thrown away as if they were worthless. I wept silently, feeling defeated and insignificant. In that moment, I realized how much I had lost, not only Richard and my home in Chicago, but also my dignity, my voice in my family, my very worth. That's when I decided I needed to do something, find a way out of this situation. But when I was 76 years old with limited financial resources and nowhere to turn, the feeling of despair was overwhelming. To compound the humiliation of that day, Kimberly insisted on giving me a gift. In front of everyone, a book on coping with the aging process with chapters on simplifying, downsizing, and not being a burden to your children. The message couldn't have been clearer if she'd shouted it in my face. Matthew looked momentarily embarrassed but quickly masked it with false excitement. "Look, Mom," he said, "how helpful. You were actually talking about wanting to organize your things better." It was a lie, of course. I'd never made such a comment. But it was easier for him to accept this narrative than to confront the obvious. Cruelty of the gift. For appearance's sake, I politely thanked him, putting the book aside with a forced smile that made my face hurt. But inside, something had shifted. A spark of indignation began to grow small but persistent. I didn't deserve this. I wasn't a burden to be tolerated or a problem to be managed. I was a person with dignity and inherent worth, and I deserved to be treated as such. In the weeks following Christmas, I tried to distance myself emotionally, creating a protective barrier around myself. I began spending more time outside, walking around the neighborhood even in the cold. Boston winter, sitting in coffee shops with a single cup of coffee that stretched for hours, visiting the local library where I could at least read and use the computer without someone checking their watch or making disparaging comments. I developed a carefully timed routine to minimize my time at home. I would leave early right after Matthew left for work and the kids for school and return only when I knew Kimberly would be out on real estate viewings. In these moments of solitude at home, I would do small tasks for the children, fixing Noah's broken toy, arranging Sophie's books alphabetically to her liking, small acts of love that might otherwise go unnoticed. But that gave me a sense of connection, however tenuous. At night, I would retire to my room early, claiming exhaustion, but really just avoiding the uncomfortable interactions that had become the norm. I would read books borrowed from the library, write in my journal, or simply watch through the small window as life unfolded outside, feeling increasingly like a spectator of my own existence. It was at the library that I met Margaret, a woman my age, who volunteered a few afternoons a week. After seeing me there regularly, she started talking to me, and we quickly developed a friendship. Margaret had perfectly styled white hair, wore vibrant red lipstick, even to the grocery store, and had a laugh that made everyone around her smile. She refused to be invisible, to conform to society's expectations of how a 70-year-old woman should behave, dress, or speak. It was a quality I envied and admired. Margaret was a widow like me, but she had 3 daughters who adored her and included her in everything. She lived in a small apartment of her own near her eldest daughter's house, maintaining her independence while still being close to her family. When she asked me about my situation, I initially gave vague answers. I was ashamed in a way to admit how I allowed myself to be treated, how I had become so passive and submissive. But Margaret had a gentle yet persistent way of asking questions and her own openness about her past struggles, including a brief and disastrous second marriage after the death of her first husband, created a safe space for honesty. When I finally mustered the courage to tell her about my situation, I expected to see pity in her eyes. Instead, I saw outrage. "This is abuse, Elizabeth," she said firmly. "Emotional and financial abuse. You need to get out of this situation. Abuse." The word echoed in my mind. I'd never thought of it in those terms before. In my generation, we didn't talk about such things. Family problems stayed within the family, and we were expected to endure our hardships in silence. The idea of labeling my daughter-in-law's behavior as abuse seemed extreme, too dramatic. But as Margaret detailed the hallmarks of emotional and financial abuse, isolation, control, manipulation, gaslighting, financial exploitation, I couldn't deny that she was describing with frightening accuracy what I was experiencing. "Elizabeth," she continued, taking my hands in hers, "this is not normal. It's not acceptable. And it's not your fault. You gave them an enormous gift, and they are using your generosity against you. This is exploitation, pure and simple." There was a clarity in her words that cut through the fog of doubt and confusion that had enveloped me for months. For the first time, I allowed myself to see the situation objectively, without the filter of guilt and familial obligation. and what I saw left me deeply disturbed. But Margaret was right. What Kimberly was doing and what Matthew was enabling through omission was abuse. It wasn't just rudeness or family tension or generational differences. It was a systematic pattern of behavior designed to diminish me, control me, and exploit my resources. Margaret helped me understand that I had options. She introduced me to a seniors support group that met weekly at the library, and there I met others who had been through similar situations. Through the group, I was introduced to community resources and social services that could help me. A social worker explained that I could apply for subsidized senior housing, that financial assistance programs were available, and that I had rights that were being violated. There was a woman in the group, Irene, who had lived with her son and daughter-in-law for a decade, gradually losing not only her savings, but also her mental health in the process. Her story was a frightening echo of my own, but with one crucial difference: Irene had found the strength to leave, to rebuild her life at 82. If she could do it, perhaps I could too. A lawyer who occasionally provided free counseling to the group explained that I had legal rights to the money I had given Matthew and Kimberly for the house. It wasn't, as Kimberly had insisted, simply a gift without conditions, but could be considered an investment in the property, giving me a legally protectable financial interest. She suggested I document everything, every penny. I'd given them every expense. I was paying every incident of emotional abuse or isolation. This advice began a new phase of self-determination. I bought a simple notebook and began meticulously recording everything, creating a record I could use if needed, but also providing an outlet for my pent-up emotions. For the first time in many months, I felt a glimmer of hope. I began secretly making plans. I applied for subsidized senior housing, knowing the waiting list was long, but at least it was a concrete step. I opened a separate bank account that Kimberly didn't know about and began depositing small amounts whenever I could save. Something slowly building an emergency fund. It was difficult with only $400 a month for all my needs, but I was creative. I sold small items I'd brought with me from Chicago's jewelry. I rarely wore books. I'd read small decorative objects I'd kept out of sentimentality, but could sacrifice for freedom. Margaret helped me list the items online since I wasn't yet comfortable with technology. Each small sale was a victory. Another few dollars in my secret account, another step toward independence. I gathered my important documents: birth certificate, Social Security card, insurance policies, tax documents, stored them in a library locker that Margaret helped me access. I no longer trusted them to be safe in my room, not after finding Kimberly rummaging through my drawers looking to borrow. Scissors, every small act of independence strengthened me, reminded me that I was still a person with value and rights. With the support group's help, I began exploring realistic housing options. A small apartment in a senior complex would cost about $1,000 a month, which would be manageable with my retirement income if I weren't paying Kimberly $1,500. But I would need a security deposit first and last months, rent and funds for basic furniture and moving. I began calculating how long it would take to save enough, and the answer was bleak. At the current rate, at least 18 months. Barring any emergencies or unexpected expenses, it was a grim prospect, but still better than no plan at all. In the meantime, I continued to endure the daily grind, strengthened only by the knowledge that it wouldn't be forever. That I was slowly but surely working toward freedom. But I knew I would eventually have to confront the situation hidden, have a difficult conversation with my son. I simply wasn't prepared for the catalyst that would make it inevitable. It was March, almost a year after my move to Boston. I'd gone to the bank to withdraw money for my weekly expenses when I noticed something strange on my account statement. The balance was much lower than it should have been. I asked the bank clerk to review recent transactions and discovered a series of large withdrawals that I certainly hadn't made. In total, over $20,000 had been withdrawn in various transactions over the past 4 months. My stomach churned as I stared at the numbers, unable to comprehend at first the magnitude of what I was seeing. How was this possible? I always guarded my bank card and information with extreme care. Someone was accessing my account and withdrawing money without my knowledge or permission. My heart sank when I saw the signatures on the withdrawal authorizations. They were forgeries of my signature, but I would recognize Kimberly's handwriting anywhere. The distinctive curve of the E in Elizabeth, the way she spelled the P in Parker. These were small details that confirmed what I already suspected Kimberly was stealing from me. During the previous months, while I was struggling to survive on $400 a month, she had stolen over $20,000 from my account. I was in shock. How was this possible? How had she gained access to my account? Then I remembered. Shortly after moving to Boston, I had fallen ill with a severe case of the flu. Kimberly had offered to pay some bills for me while I was bedridden, and I had naively given her some banking information. I had trusted her as family, never imagining she would use it to steal from me. I sat on the bank bench, feeling physically ill with the revelation. The clerk, noticing my pallor, asked if I was okay if I would like a glass of water. "Yes, please," I said weakly, and as he walked away to get water, I tried to gather my thoughts. This wasn't just morally repugnant, it was a crime. Forgery, theft, financial fraud, these were serious offenses that could result in criminal charges. But the thought of involving the police, of potentially seeing Kimberly arrested, was terrifying. Not for her, but for the impact it would have on Matthew, Sophie, and Noah. How could I explain to my grandchildren that their mother was being investigated for stealing from her own grandmother? But at the same time, I couldn't simply ignore it. It wasn't just the money, although $20,000 was a significant amount to me. It was the beginning, the violation of trust, the confirmation of everything Margaret and the support group had made me see. This was abuse, plain and simple, and it couldn't go on any longer. With shaking hands, I gathered my courage and went straight home, determined to confront Kimberly immediately. I found her in the living room working on her laptop. When she saw me, she smiled, that fake smile I'd come to despise. Before she could say anything, I spread the bank statements on the table in front of her. "What's this?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. She glanced at the papers, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes. Not remorse or shame, but irritation at being found out. Then she quickly composed her expression. Elizabeth, it was just a temporary loan. Matthew and I had some unexpected expenses, and since you're living here rent-free, I thought you wouldn't mind helping out. I intended to pay it all back eventually." "For free," I repeated, incredulous. "I pay $1,500 a month to live in a back room of a house I helped buy with $180,000 of my savings. And if you needed money, why not just ask like a normal, honest person? Why forge my signature and steal from me?" My voice was rising, indignation temporarily overcoming my usual reserve. Kimberly rolled her eyes as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. "You're so dramatic, Elizabeth. That money was a gift, remember? And as for your monthly contribution, it barely covers the inconvenience of having you here. You think I have it easy? Having to adapt my entire life and my family's routine to accommodate an elderly woman who can no longer care for herself." Her words hit me like a slap, but this time, instead of cringing, I felt something break inside me. It wasn't just anger. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing months of pent-up hurt, pain, and resentment. "Is this what you're telling my son, that I'm a nuisance? That I can't take care of myself anymore? I've built a life, raised a son, worked for 40 years as a nurse, cared for my husband through his illness until the end, and you have the audacity to insinuate that I'm incapable." At that moment, Matthew walked through the front door earlier than usual. He stopped when he saw us facing each other, confusion on his face. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking from me to Kimberly. Before Kimberly could speak, I handed him the bank statements. "Your wife has been stealing money from my account, Matthew. Over $20,000 in the last few months." Matthew examined the papers, his face growing pale as he realized what he was seeing. Kimberly immediately adopted a hurt expression. "Matt, it's not what it seems. I was going to give it back, I swear. We were struggling financially, you know that. The kids, bills, the house repairs. I was just trying to keep our family afloat. Please, you have to believe me." Matthew looked lost, his eyes darting between us, clearly torn between loyalty to his wife and the undeniable evidence in front of him. That's when I realized he knew. Maybe not about the specific theft, but he knew about the rest, about how Kimberly treated me, about the isolation, the humiliations, the financial control. And he had chosen to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening. The disappointment I felt in that moment was deeper than any I had ever experienced. This was my son, the child I had raised, loved, and sacrificed so much for. And he had abandoned me when I needed him most. "So you knew," I said softly, looking directly at Matthew. The statement, not a question, hung in the air between us. His face contorted, wordlessly confirming what I had already realized. He knew and had allowed it to continue, had become complicit through inaction. "You knew how she treats me, how she isolates me, how she humiliates me, how she demands every little thing from me as if I were an unwanted tenant and not your mother. And you did nothing. Said nothing, you just let it happen." The words came out heavy with pain, not as an accusation, but as a realization of a painful truth I was finally facing. Matthew's eyes filled with tears, more from shame than sadness, I realized. "Mom, it's not that simple." He began, but his voice cracked. He had no defense, no justification that could erase the fact that he had chosen the path of least resistance at the expense of my well-being. Something shifted inside me. A resolve formed clear and unshakable. I wouldn't stay there any longer, no longer be a victim of this situation. If my own son couldn't or wouldn't protect me, then I would protect myself. For the first time in a year, I felt completely lucid, as if I had emerged from a fog of denial and rationalization. This wasn't my home. These people weren't my family, not in the way that truly mattered. A family is built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and protecting one another. What we had here was a commercial transaction disguised as a family relationship, and a deeply unfair one at that. I climbed the stairs to my room, ignoring Matthew's calls behind me. I began gathering my things, packing what I could carry into a suitcase. Clothes, a few photos, important documents that were still with me. The diary where I kept Sophie's drawing, and the photograph of me and Richard. Small treasures that represented my identity, my connections, my history. As I did so, Matthew entered the room, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. "Mom, what are you doing? You can't just leave." "Let's talk about this, work things out." The tone was almost identical to the one I'd used when I was a teenager and had done something wrong, wanting to negotiate my way out of the consequences. But I was no longer the mother who gave in, who smoothed things over, who prioritized family peace above all else, including my own dignity. I stopped what I was doing and looked directly at him. "Work things out, Matthew. This has been going on for almost a year. Your wife isolated me, humiliated me, controlled my money, and now I've discovered she's been stealing from me. And you allowed this to happen. Where were you when she confined me to my room, when she kept the kids away from me, when she made me feel like an unwanted burden in a house?" I helped by Matthew's face contorted with guilt and discomfort. He began to mumble excuses, saying he didn't know it was that bad that Kimberly had said. I was overreacting, that he was busy with work and the kids. Empty excuses that only confirmed what I already knew: he had chosen to look the other way. I continued packing my suitcase as I spoke. "I sold my apartment in Chicago and gave you $180,000 to buy this house. I paid $1,500 a month to live here, leaving me with practically nothing for my own needs. I took care of your children, cooked, cleaned, did everything I could to be useful and not a burden. And how was I repaid? With abuse and theft. But the worst betrayal, Matthew, came from you. From a son who wouldn't stand up for his own mother." My words hit him like physical blows. He recoiled, his face showing for the first time a true understanding of the magnitude of his failure. Matthew looked genuinely shaken, now tears beginning to form in his eyes. "Mom, please, don't go like this. I promise I'll fix this. I'll talk to Kimberly, make sure she returns the money, make her treat you better. Please give us another chance." I looked at my son, this grown man who seemed so lost in that moment, and felt a mixture of love, disappointment, and new determination. "I'm going to a friend's house tonight," I said, referring to Margaret, who had offered me her sofa bed until I found a permanent solution. "When I'm settled somewhere, I'll be in touch. As for the money, it's not just about the money, Matthew. It's about respect, dignity, being valued as a person, not treated like a burden or an ATM. And not something you can simply promise to fix with a conversation. I packed my suitcase and prepared to leave, but before Kimberly appeared in the bedroom doorway, her face a mask of forced indignation. "What do you think you're doing? You can't just leave. What about the children? Are you going to abandon them like that?" I almost laughed at her audacity. After months of preventing me from seeing my grandchildren, she was now feigning concern about the impact of my departure on them. It was at that moment that she saw that I had removed the ring Richard had given me from my finger, the one I had always worn since our wedding ceremony in 1967. I held it in the palm of my hand, intending to place it in a small jewelry box for safekeeping during the trip. For some reason, this seemed to infuriate her. "Do you really think you can survive out there alone? You're a useless old woman." "That ring means nothing. You don't deserve love," she screamed, snatching the ring from my hand and throwing it into the adjacent bathroom trash can. My hands trembled, my heart breaking as she laughed. This was Kimberly's true face, the mask of civility, completely abandoned. But in that moment, something crystallized inside me. A secret I had kept for months, not out of fear of her, but out of consideration for my son. A secret I now realized needed to be revealed. I looked directly at her, my voice calm but firm. "I know about you and Thomas Kimberly. Thomas Kimberly's coworker, with whom I'd seen her at a downtown cafe 3 months ago. Holding hands, exchanging kisses when they thought no one was looking. I'd kept this information to myself, not wanting to cause further conflict in an already tense family, especially because of the grandchildren. But now, seeing this woman's blatant cruelty, I realized my silence wasn't protecting anyone but her." Kimberly's face paled instantly. Her sneer disappeared, replaced by a look of shock and fear. Matthew, who was behind her, stepped forward, confusion in his eyes. "What is she talking about, Kim? What's this story about Thomas?" Kimberly tried to recover, forcing a laugh that came out shrill and fake. "She's delusional, Matt. Thomas is just a coworker, you know that. She's making up stories because she's angry." I kept my gaze fixed on Kimberly as I spoke. "December 3rd, Cafe Nero on Newberry Street. You were wearing your red coat and that scarf Matthew gave you for your anniversary. You sat in the back, but I was on the other side of the cafe. I saw everything, Kimberly. And I took pictures." The mention of pictures was a partial bluff. I had indeed taken a picture with my old phone, but I wasn't sure of the quality or if I had captured anything incriminating. But Kimberly didn't know that, and the implied threat was enough. Matthew looked at his wife, understanding slowly dawning on his face. "Kim, is it true?" Kimberly began to stammer denials, but her face betrayed her. Guilt was written in every line, in every nervous movement of her eyes. I had proof, of course. The photos were safely stored in the cloud thanks to the help of Margaret, who had taught me how to use these modern technologies. As Matthew and Kimberly began a heated argument, I silently knelt down and retrieved my ring from the trash, placing it back on my finger where it belonged. I wouldn't let 53 years of love and commitment end in a bathroom trash can. The ring was more than a piece of metal. It was a tangible symbol of the life I'd built with Richard, of the strength he'd always seen in me, of the promise we'd made to each other to care for each other until the end. And though Richard was no longer physically present, I felt his spirit with me in that moment, giving me courage, reminding me of who I truly was. So, with a dignity I hadn't felt in a long time, I grabbed my suitcase and left the room, heading downstairs as the argument continued upstairs. In the living room, I found Sophie and Noah, who had just returned from school with the babysitter, who picked them up on the afternoons Kimberly worked late. They were confused by the commotion coming from upstairs. "Grandma, what's going on?" Sophie asked, her voice small and worried. I knelt before them, my heart breaking at having to leave them, but knowing it was necessary. "Grandma needs to go away for a while, darlings. But I want you to know that I love you both very much, and that will never change." Noah's eyes filled with tears, and he threw his small arms around my neck in a tight hug. "Don't go, Grandma," he begged. I felt his small body tremble against mine, and for a moment I almost weakened. How could I leave them? But then I remembered that staying in our current circumstances wouldn't benefit either of us in the long run. What kind of example would I be setting for them if I allowed myself to be treated this way? What lesson would they learn about respect, about setting boundaries, about self-worth? Tears streamed down my face as I hugged him back, breathing in his sweet, childlike scent, memorizing the feel of his arms around me. Sophie seemed more reserved, more cautious, a reflection of the months of distancing orchestrated by Kimberly. But there was genuine concern in her eyes. "Will you come back?" she asked. I promised her I would, that we would find a way, that we would still be in touch. I gave each of them a small card with Margaret's phone number, explaining that they could call me there if they needed me. "That's against the rules," Sophie said, glancing nervously at the stairs. "Mommy says we're not supposed to make phone calls without permission." The girl who had just begun to learn the art of navigating a controlling household, a skill no child should need to master. "Sometimes, Sophie," I replied softly, "we have to follow our hearts, even when it's hard. And my heart tells me that you two are the most important people in the world to me, and nothing will change that." So with a last hug and words of love, I grabbed my suitcase and walked out the front door, never looking back. I hailed a taxi and gave Margaret's address. As the car pulled away from the house I had helped buy, I felt a mix of overwhelming emotions. Grief for leaving my grandchildren, anger for the way I had been treated, fear of the unknown that awaited me, but also, surprisingly, a growing sense of freedom and determination. For the first time in a long time, I was taking control of my own life. I was saying no to abuse and disrespect. I was choosing myself, my dignity, and my well-being. And in that moment, despite the tears streaming down my face, I felt an inner strength I hadn't known I still possessed. The taxi driver, an older man with a kind face, watched me in the rearview mirror. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "No," I answered honestly, "but I will be." The simple truth of those words surprised me. I would be okay. Not immediately, not without effort, but eventually. I had survived loss before, had rebuilt my life after Richard's death. I could do it again. When we arrived at Margaret's apartment building, I paid the taxi driver, leaving a generous tip that I couldn't really afford, but that somehow felt important. Small act of autonomy and generosity. On a day marked by selfishness and pettiness. Margaret was waiting at the entrance, and when she saw my face, she knew immediately that the situation had reached a critical point. Without saying anything, she simply opened her arms, and I entered that embrace, allowing myself to be comforted for the first time in a long time. "I'm so proud of you, Elizabeth," she whispered in my ear. "I know how hard this was, but you did the right thing. And you're not alone. Not anymore." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity and adjustments. Margaret, bless her heart, not only offered me a place to stay temporarily, but mobilized her entire network to help me. Her son-in-law, John, a lawyer, helped me understand my legal options regarding the money I had given to Matthew and Kimberly, as well as the money Kimberly had stolen from my account. "You have a strong case for claiming part of the property," he explained, "especially if you can document that the money was given specifically for the purchase of the house, not as an unrestricted gift." Fortunately, I had retained emails and text messages from Matthew from when we initially discussed the arrangement, in which he explicitly referred to my contribution to the house as an investment and talked about how we would all be Cooners. John helped draft a formal letter to Matthew outlining my complaint and requesting a resolution. "We didn't want to go straight to legal action," he explained, "as that could permanently damage my relationship with my son, but we needed to establish a clear position." One of her daughters, Rebecca, who worked in real estate, began looking for small, affordable apartments for me. She showed me options in different neighborhoods, explaining the pros and cons of each, helping me visualize what my life would be like in these new spaces. She understood my need not only for affordable housing, but also for community access to public transportation, proximity to libraries, and other resources that had become my lifelines during the difficult months. The library support group became my cornerstone, offering not only emotional support, but also practical advice and even small donations to help me rebuild my financial independence. One group member Howard was a retired accountant and reviewed my finances, helping me create a realistic budget for my new independent life. He helped me understand that while my situation wasn't ideal, it wasn't hopeless. With my interest in the house, acknowledged the recovery of the stolen money, and my modest retirement income, I could survive. It wouldn't be luxurious, but it would be sustainable, and most importantly, it would be mine. During this time, I received numerous messages and calls from Matthew. At first, they were mostly pleas for me to come back, promises that things would be different. But as the days turned into weeks, the tone changed. He told me he had confronted Kimberly about the affair, that she had initially denied everything, but eventually confessed when he showed her the photos I had mentioned. He said they were in counseling, trying to determine if the marriage could be saved. He said he had demanded that Kimberly return all the money she had taken from my account, and that he was willing to sign a document acknowledging my share of the house for the initial investment I had made. In our conversations, I saw a son struggling to reconcile the man he had become with the boy I had raised to be honest, fair, and courageous. I saw his shame and regret, and while part of me wanted to simply forgive him and forget everything, another part knew that some wounds needed time to heal. So I kept my distance, accepting his calls but declining his invitations to come home or even visit, at least for now. I needed to establish my independence first, regain my sense of self-worth before I could consider any kind of reconciliation. I never tried to poison his relationship with Kimberly, despite the anger I still felt. After all, she was the mother of my grandchildren, and as difficult as it was to admit, her well-being was intertwined with theirs. When Matthew asked if I thought they should try to save their marriage, I answered honestly, that's a decision only the two of you can make. But I suggest you consider not just past mistakes, but the pattern of behavior, the capacity for genuine change, and above all, what will be healthiest for Sophie and Noah in the long run. He seemed surprised by my measured response, perhaps expecting me to insist on separation as revenge for how I had been treated. But revenge was never my goal. Healing, dignity, justice, these were my goals. And sometimes justice means allowing people to face the natural consequences of their actions, not imposing additional punishments. The children were harder. Noah called Margaret's number almost every day, their small talk filled with stories about school, his friends, a new cartoon he'd discovered. Each call ended with him asking when I was coming home, and each time my heart broke a little more at having to say no yet. How could I explain to a 60-year-old the complexities of emotional and financial abuse, the need to set healthy boundaries, the process of regaining dignity? Instead, I spoke in terms he could understand about how Grandma needed her own space for a while, but that didn't mean I loved him any less. I promised we'd find ways to spend time together soon when things calmed down. Sophie was more reserved, calling less frequently, her conversations more guarded. But over time, even she began to open up, sharing her thoughts and feelings in ways she hadn't in months. She said her mom and dad were fighting a lot, that the house felt different without me, that she missed me. One night, about a month after I left, she surprised me by asking if I thought she would be like her mother when she grew up. The question caught me off guard, and it took me a moment to answer. Sophie, you will be whoever you want to be. But know this, you already have a kind heart and a strong mind. Trust them to guide you, and you will become a wonderful woman. I heard her smile through the phone, and I wondered if my words had reached her, if she had truly understood what I was saying. Sophie, perceptive beyond her years, seemed to understand more than she let on. Grandma, she said one night after sharing about her day at school, Mommy changed after you left. What do you mean, honey? I asked, curious about her insight. She cries a lot, Sophie said thoughtfully, and apologizes for things. She never apologized before. The observation surprised me. Sophie, only 9 years old, had grasped a significant change that I, in my grief, was unprepared to consider: the possibility that Kimberly was genuinely sorry, or at least experiencing the emotional consequences of her actions. I wondered if this was just a ploy to gain Matthew's sympathy, or if there was actually a seed of real remorse. People can change when confronted with the consequences of their actions, when a mirror is held up to their ugliest behaviors. But genuine change requires more than temporary remorse. It requires honest self-examination, a commitment to new behaviors, and a willingness to make amends. Time would tell if Kimberly was really on this path or just playing the role of the regretful wife. Meanwhile, with the help of our lawyer, we formalized a settlement with Matthew and Kimberly. They acknowledged in writing that $180,000 of the house's value belonged to me, essentially, making me a 30% cooner. They also agreed to return the money that had been taken from my account without authorization with interest. It was a beginning of reparation, at least financially. In the settlement, we also included clauses regarding my right to see and maintain contact with my grandchildren without interference or obstruction. There would never be another Christmas where my gifts were discarded, another birthday where my presence was minimized, another special occasion from which I would be excluded. These terms were not legally binding in the same way as the financial provisions, but their inclusion in the document represented a formal acknowledgement of past wrongs and a commitment to better practices in the future. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, an acknowledgement of wrongs, and a step toward justice. What was most surprising, however, was the change in Kimberly. After the revelation of the affair and the very real threat of losing her marriage, family, she seemed to have undergone some kind of transformation. The few times we spoke on the phone, always with Matthew present, she was humble, almost subservient. She apologized repeatedly, promised changes, begged for a chance to make things right. I listened to her words with skepticism, of course. I had learned the hard way that people rarely change fundamentally, especially when that change goes against their personal interests. But I also recognized that traumatic events could sometimes serve as catalysts for self-reflection and growth. The public revelation of her affair, the near loss of her marriage, the confrontation with the magnitude of the damage she had caused, these were the kinds of shocks that could sometimes break old patterns and open space for new possibilities. Time would tell whether her repentance was genuine or just a performance to save her marriage and lifestyle. For my part, I maintained a posture of polite caution. I didn't reject their apology, but I also didn't offer easy absolution. True forgiveness, I learned, is not a one-time event, but a process, and it requires not just words of repentance, but consistent actions that demonstrate real change. In early May, about 2 months after my abrupt departure, I found a small one-bedroom apartment in a senior complex on Boston's West Side. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, safe, and most importantly, mine. It was located on the second floor with a small balcony that received morning sun, perfect for the plants I'd always loved growing. The complex was just a few blocks from a bus line that connected directly to the Boston subway, making it relatively easy for me to get around the city. There was a library 2 blocks away, a small supermarket on the corner, and a park with a lake, where I could walk on summer mornings. With the acknowledgement of my equity in the house and the return of the stolen money, I had enough funds to pay rent for quite some time, even considering my limited retirement income. The complex offered social activities, transportation to doctor's appointments, and shopping, and even a small community garden where residents could grow vegetables and flowers. The day I signed the lease was one of the happiest and scariest of my life. Happy because it represented my regained independence, my ability to care for myself and create a space that was truly mine. Scary because at 76, I was essentially starting over, creating a new home, new routines, new connections. The move was simplified by the fact that I had few belongings, only what I had managed to pack in that lonely suitcase, plus a few items Margaret had helped me buy or that had been donated by members of the support group. Matthew insisted on bringing some boxes from the basement that contained my remaining belongings, books, photo albums, some china that had belonged to my mother. When he delivered the boxes, he seemed nervous, uncomfortable in my new space, as if he felt his presence there was an intrusion. I helped him carry the boxes inside, thanked him for his effort, and then we stood awkwardly in the small living room to strangers who had once been so close. "Mom," he finally said, breaking the silence, "I'm sorry for everything." The words were simple, but they rang true. There was no apology, no attempt to explain or justify, just a direct acknowledgement of failure. I accepted his apology with a hug, feeling his tense body relax a little against mine. It was a beginning, a first step on a path of reconciliation that would be long and sometimes difficult. Before leaving, he surprised me with a small gift, a plant in a decorative pot for my balcony. It was a camellia, the same flower Richard used to give me on our birthdays. I don't know if Matthew remembered this detail or if it was just coincidence, but the symbolism touched me deeply. That small plant became the first of many that would adorn my new home, a living symbol of renewal and growth. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life. I made friends with the other residents, many of whom had gone through their own experiences of loss and new beginnings. There was Bill, an 82-year-old widower who had lost his wife to Alzheimer's after 55 years of marriage, and who now ran a small support group for people who had lost partners to dementia. There was Rosa, a Colombian immigrant who had raised 3 children alone after her husband was deported in the 1980s, and who now taught free Spanish classes at the local library. There were Harry and Steve, married for almost 40 years, who had faced discrimination and family rejection only to build a beautiful life together, and who now hosted monthly dinners for lonely residents of the complex. These people, with their stories of resilience and grace in the face of adversity, became my new tribe. I joined a reading group that met in the community room every Wednesday, discovering or rediscovering the joy of books. I hadn't had time to read during the stressful months at Matthew and Kimberly's house. I picked up old hobbies I'd long abandoned: knitting, container gardening, amateur watercolor painting. Each new activity, each new connection, each small decision about how to decorate my space or how to spend my time was an affirmation of my regained autonomy, of my right to exist on my own terms. I continued attending the library support group, now not so much out of personal need, but to help others going through what I had. I offered my experience, my understanding, and when possible, practical assistance. There was one woman in particular, Dorothy, who came to the group in tears, recounting how her son-in-law had controlled every aspect of her life since she had moved in with her daughter after a stroke. I recognized in her eyes the same despair I had felt, and I committed to helping her find her own independence and dignity. I had long conversations with Dorothy, listening to her story, sharing resources, helping her identify patterns of abuse, and formulating an action plan. Together, we contacted social services, researched affordable housing, and even made a furtive visit to her home when her son-in-law was away to retrieve important documents and sentimental items. It was a slow process filled with setbacks and moments of doubt, but gradually we helped Dorothy set boundaries, claim her space, and eventually move into her own apartment in an assisted living setting. When I helped her unpack her things in her new home, she hugged me with tears in her eyes. "I never thought I'd be free again," she whispered. "You saved me." "No, Dorothy," I replied, "you saved yourself. I just showed you it was possible." Seeing her transform from a broken and fearful woman to someone who smiled, again made jokes and made plans for the future, was incredibly rewarding. I realized I had found a new purpose to use my own painful experience to help others in similar situations. It was through the support group that I met Susan, a retired social worker who still worked part-time as an advocate for seniors, helping them navigate the complex systems that often left them vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. After hearing my story and seeing how I was helping others in the group, she asked if I would be interested in working with her as a volunteer, helping to identify and support other seniors at risk. Thus, at 76, I began a new, unpaid but deeply satisfying career using my nursing experience, my newfound knowledge of social services, and my own personal story to make a difference in the lives of others. 3 days a week, I sat with Susan in her small office, answering phones, reviewing cases, and occasionally making home visits to seniors who had been identified as potentially at risk. The work was emotionally demanding, sometimes heartbreaking, but also incredibly rewarding. Every person we helped find safety, every abuser we confronted, every system we successfully navigated was a small victory against the vulnerability and helplessness I myself had experienced. Over time, my relationship with Matthew also began to heal. It wasn't easy, and there were many difficult conversations and uncomfortable moments. He had to face his own complicity in what had happened, acknowledge how he had failed me as a son. One rainy June afternoon, sitting in my small living room as the rain beat against the windows, we had perhaps our most honest conversation since I had left his house. "Why didn't you say anything, Matthew?" I finally asked a question that had been hovering between us for months. "Why did you let all of this happen?" He was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. I was scared, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Scared of what? Scared of losing my family? Scared of ending up alone if I stood against Kimberly? Scared of what if I truly saw what was happening, I would have to do something about it, and I didn't know if I had the courage to do that. It was easier to pretend I wasn't seeing it, to convince myself you were overreacting or that things would get better on their own. It was an act of cowardice, and I will never forgive myself for it." There was so much pain in his words, so much shame, that I felt my heart open to him in a way I hadn't been able to for months. "Matthew," I said, taking his hands in mine, "we all fail sometimes. We all make choices we regret, especially when fear is driving us." He looked at me, surprise in his eyes. "Do you forgive me after all?" "It's a process," I replied honestly. "It doesn't happen all at once. But we're on this path together now, and I have faith in you, in the person I know you truly are." That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. It didn't erase the past, it didn't completely eradicate the hurt, but it opened space for a new kind of connection, one based not on prescribed motherson roles, but on a mutual recognition of our shared humanity, our flaws, and our capacity for growth. And I had to work through my resentment, learn to forgive without forgetting to move forward, without denying the past. It wasn't easy letting go of the hurt that had built up during those months of abuse and neglect. There were nights when I lay in bed reliving particularly painful insults, moments of humiliation, occasions when Matthew had witnessed my degradation and said nothing. In these moments, anger threatened to consume me, making forgiveness seem not only difficult, but impossible. But slowly, with the help of friends like Margaret, the support group, and my own determination not to let bitterness define my future, I began to let go. Not to forget, never to deny, but to accept what had happened and choose a path forward unconstrained by the past. We began with supervised visits with him, bringing the children to see me in my new apartment. Sophie and Noah loved the place, especially the small balcony where I had placed pots of colorful flowers and a bird feeder. As the months passed, our relationships gradually reestablished themselves on healthier foundations. Matthew and Kimberly divorced, and I found new purpose helping other seniors escape abusive situations. A year after throwing my wedding ring in the trash, Kimberly came to visit me alone, bringing a sincere apology and the confession that she was in therapy for her control issues and insecurity. I forgave her, not for her sake, but for my own, finally freeing myself from the burden of resentment. Today at 78, I live in my own apartment, surrounded by dear friends, with my grandchildren visiting regularly, and I finally understood what Richard was trying to tell me. My strength has always been within me, just waiting for me to recognize it. If you identified with my story, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. In the comments, tell me, have you ever needed to reclaim your dignity from someone who was supposed to protect it? Remember, it's never too late to start over and demand the respect you deserve.